Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the workshop on metaphysical inquiries. So the first talk will be about criticism of hyperintentionality. And out of politeness, I asked Leon, who is one of the organizers of today's workshop. The workshop is organized by the Institute of Philosophy. And I asked Leon whether I should introduce our first speaker, Tim Williamson, who teaches at USI at the MAP. So I asked Leon whether I should introduce him. Leon told me it was not necessary, so I'll use this rare chance to do a mic drop. So please welcome our first speaker.
So this talk is part of what people call a wider project, which has to do with a methodological pathology that is well known in the natural and social sciences, but which not that many philosophers have heard of, and so part of the aim is to do a bit of consciousness raising about this pathology and why we should be avoiding it. So let me say what the pathology is. It's roughly speaking, it's introducing many degrees of freedom into our theories or models, many, as it were, parameters of the model, or in rougher terms, making the models allowing them to be much more complicated, in order to fit the data that we are trying to model. And I mean, you might think that fitting the data closely it's a good thing, but it turns out that this is actually a methodological disaster if you allow yourself too many degrees of freedom, because what happens in practice is that the theories that you get, I mean, they may model the current data very well, but then when new data come in, you have to revise the theory and introduce even more parameters, give yourself even more flexibility to model the new data, and so you don't get anything that's very predictive, and you don't get stability. And the reason, or at least one of the reasons why this happens, is because I mean, most data sets in science involve some errors. I mean, you can't, the data won't be error-free, and so if you're giving yourself the flexibility to model the data very closely, what's happening is that you're modeling errors in the data. I mean, erroneous data. And so your theory is off from the start. Whereas if you're much more parsimonious in the number of parameters that you allow yourself, and this, roughly speaking, insist on much simpler models, although the data won't be modeled quite as closely, but you'll have a much better idea of what the outliers are, the erroneous data points, and so that in the long run you get a more stable and predictive theory. And as I said, this is something that it's known very well in the sciences. I mean, I've got to ask scientists, so is overfitting a problem in your area? And then usually, well, I mean, in fact, I've always had the answer yes, and then often followed by a rant against the scientists who go in for overfitting and how bad that is. So that's very different from what you get in formal philosophy, where introducing a new parameter into a model is regarded as an exciting, promising, constructive innovation, and the flexibility that it gives is regarded as a good thing. And so in my view, that attitude is actually rather naive. And I want to explore the consequences of what I would diagnose as overfitting in a specific case in metaphysics. And a lot of the work will be in understanding what the specific cause of the errors in the data are, because of course it's not obvious straight off that metaphysics should be thought of as some kind of data fitting enterprise. But when you have a form of metaphysics that is to a large extent driven by examples and by the kind of unreflective judgments that or semi-unreflective judgments that we make about these examples, then these judgments are in effect playing the role of data in the investigation. And what you tend to find is an attitude which is, not unlike a rather kind of naive Popperian falsificationism, where the methodological self-image is just of universal generalizations being tested and then refuted by counterexamples. And of course, the problem with naive falsificationism is, well, what about the possibility that you made some error in the judgments about a specific case, which is being treated as a counterexample. And I'm going to be exploring these methodological issues in relation to a current trend in metaphysics known as hyperintentionalism. In fact, people sometimes talk now about the hyperintentional revolution, where the intentional revolution was supposed to be something that happened, roughly speaking, in the early 1960s with the development of possible world semantics by Kripke and David Lewis and Stolnaker and so on, and where a form of philosophizing that took its sort of logical framework from extensional logic was replaced by one where the operative framework tended to be intentional logic. And then supposedly what we had roughly speaking, in the 1990s was this hyperintentional revolution, where the intentional framework that people have been working with post Kripke was replaced by some hyperintentional approach. And the key difference is really that with an intentional approach, if you substitute necessarily equivalent expressions in a bigger sentence, you get the same truth value. But if in a hyperintentional framework, that can make a difference. And this approach which I would rather think of not so much as a hyperintentional revolution as a hyperintentional attempted coup, was driven very much by examples. And also, I mean, as in this characteristic of overfitting, it motivates greatly increased complexity in the models, and you can see that with, for example, once people start doing impossible world semantics, there's a massive increase in the degrees of freedom because you no longer have the truth value of a complex sentence at one of these impossible worlds determined by the truth values of its constituents. And that means that, as we're rather than simply treating the atomic sentences as, if you like, individual degrees of freedom, all the complex sentences also are treated as each of them introducing a new degree of freedom. But on a kind of less uncontrolled framework like that, for example, truth maker semantics, you can also see an increase in the number of degrees of freedom, because when it comes to handling negation, some new elements are introduced into the framework. I mean, maybe a separate treatment for falsification, which isn't determined by the treatment of verification, or maybe by the introduction of some kind of incompatibility relation between states, or whatever it is, which is all of these are further degrees of freedom. And when you start looking at hyperintentional theories of propositions, which are thought of as kind of structured entities with a structure that corresponds, roughly speaking, to the syntactic structure of the sentences that express them to some degree, then that also gives you much more complex theories of propositions with more degrees of freedom. But of course, the question is, well, if the examples that are being used to motivate hyperintentionalism are watertight, then we may just have to accept these extra degrees of freedom because intentional approaches have simply been refuted if these examples work. But I want to explain why these examples are not fully trustworthy, and to show how they could be produced by a heuristic that we psychologically rely on, but a heuristic which, like other heuristics that psychologists are interested in, that is not fully reliable. I mean, it's a fairly commonplace observation amongst psychologists that a lot of human judgment involves heuristics, and which are sometimes described as cognitive shortcuts, but something like, well, if you're being nice about them, you describe them as fast and frugal methods, as in the tradition of ignorance, or as if you're not being so nice about them, maybe in the tradition of Kahneman and Tversky, then you describe them as cheap and dirty. But the thing is that these heuristics are things that we rely on all the time. I mean, for example, in vision, one heuristic that we unreflectively rely on is using the color boundaries of objects as a guide to the physical boundaries. The color boundaries in the visual field as a guide to the actual boundaries of three-dimensional objects out there in the environment. And I mean, it's a pretty good heuristic. We use it a lot, but it's not infallible. And something that brings out its limits is the use of camouflage in warfare, because that is exactly exploiting the limitations of this heuristic in our visual systems. And there are lots of other ones which we could talk about. But I mean, that human beings use lots of heuristics in judgment. It's not really in question. Okay, let's get to the details. So on the handout now, I've got some examples of which are just fairly well-known examples that are to illustrate the sort of data that is supposed to refute an intentional approach. So if we start with the pair 1A and 1B, the judgments that we're supposed to make about 1A and 1B are that 1A is true. It's essential to Socrates that he is Socrates. But 1B is false. It's not essential to Socrates that he's a member of the singleton set of Socrates. And then the idea is, well, if there's a difference between the truth 1A and 1B in truth value, that must be a hyperintentional difference, because being Socrates and being a member of singleton Socrates are necessarily equivalent, given the sort of background metaphysics of sets, which I will not be challenging. And so I'm granting that he is Socrates and he's a member of singleton Socrates. Those are necessarily equivalent. This is a classic example from Kit Fine's paper from 1994, Essence and Modality. And I think it's true that we are inclined to make the judgments that Fine is relying on, and that what 1A, I mean, doesn't seem like a very interesting example of an essential property, but it seems sure it is essential, and with 1B. It does seem that sort of introducing the singleton Socrates is kind of bringing in something that's completely extraneous to the subject matter, and so I think it is a genuine phenomenon that there is a difference in our reactions to 1A and 1B. The case of 2A and 2B is another one. Of course, this kind of example, although not with, I guess, with Snow, goes back to Aristotle. So it's not as though hyperintentionalism in a way is such a new thing, but it seems like that if you say the proposition that Snow is white is true because Snow is white, that seems like that's correct, because that's the right order of explanation. It's because of this worldly fact that Snow is white that the proposition that Snow is white is true. Whereas the converse claim that Snow is white because the proposition that Snow is white is true, it seems very off, because how is it that some fact about Snow is being explained by these fancy things about certain propositions being true, and also, of course, if you think that X because Y and Y because X, I mean, the because has to be asymmetric, then if you have 2A, you can't have 2B, and then the case for hyperintentionality here is simply that Snow is white and the proposition that Snow is white is true, that these seem to be necessarily equivalent. And again, I'm not going to deny that they're necessarily equivalent. And so what we've got is a case where substituting necessarily equivalent sentences within the scope of because seems to be producing a difference in truth value. and that would show that because is a hyperintensional operator. And then the third pair, this is an example that goes back to a paper by Elliot Sober in the early 1980s. I mean, he doesn't set it up quite in terms of hyperintentionality, but I mean, it is effectively that. And so the background is we're assuming that triangle and trilateral are necessarily equivalent terms. Triangle is, you know, something like regular figure with 3 angles, and trilateral is a regular figure with 3 sides. But you know, if you get the definitions right, it will be the case that being a triangle and being a trilateral are necessarily equivalent. And then Sober has an example where you have a machine that is sorting figures, and some of them it outputs and some of them it doesn't. I mean, it's physically sorting the actual, you know, things with these shapes. It's not dealing with representations of them. And the machine is counting the angles. It's not counting the sides. I mean, that's, you know, there's obviously a causal difference there. And then the idea is, well, if it's counting the angles and it does output a certain figure, because it's counting the angles, the reason why it output the figure was because it was a triangle, not because it was a trilateral, even though those things are necessarily equivalent. And so I mean, what Sober was interested in arguing was that the property of being a triangle and the property of being a trilateral are distinct properties because they have distinct causal powers, even though necessarily whatever has one property also has the other. So that's a kind of sampling of examples which are used to motivate a hyperintentional approach. And, you know, I think none of these examples is a stupid one. I mean, they're all ones which, you know, when you first come to them, they actually tend to seem quite compelling. And I mean, they do seem like counterexamples to an intentional treatment of these cases. Now, I want to propose a heuristic that I think we're using when we assess examples like this. I think it's most obvious in the case of because, but it's also relevant to the things about essentiality. I'll say a little bit about why that's the case. So the hypothesis is this, that a kind of heuristic that we use when we're assessing something of the form A because B is that we, in effect, we consider the hypothetical conversational exchange where somebody asks why A and they're given the answer B, and that we kind of form an assessment of the how satisfactory a conversational exchange that is, and so as it were, we kind of imagine ourselves into the position of the person who's asked the question. I mean, are they going to be happy with, you know, satisfied with the answer, or should they be? And then that is read as an assessment of the, in effect, of the truth value of the A because B. So if the exchange is satisfactory, then we'll regard A because B as true, and if it's kind of unsatisfactory, we'll regard it as false. I mean, by the way, I should say that the heuristics are pretty much always defeasible. So it's not that you can't go against a heuristic. It's more like as well that this is a default that you'll go with. I should emphasize that there are different readings of both Y and because, and I think in somewhat different ways, we can apply the same heuristic to them, but with correlative readings of the Y and the because. So there's a causal reading of Y and because, which goes with where a sort of conversation exchange where somebody asks why was NN a murderer, and then it's given the answer his parents violently abused him. So that's a causal explanation why he became a murderer. You can also, this is, I think, the less clear than the other two readings, but you definitely can get it, which is kind of evidential one, where you ask why was NN a murderer, and really what you're asking for is evidence that NN was a murderer, and then and so something like he confessed the murder to the police would be a satisfactory answer on that reading. And you can also have a constitutive reading, maybe the one of most interest in metaphysics, where when you ask why was NN a murderer, you're sort of asking something like, in virtue of what was NN a murderer? And then being told that, well, he intentionally killed his wife by poisoning her would be an answer to that question. And so the heuristic can be used for, I think, for all three of these readings, but you just have to make sure that you're treating the Y and because correlatively. One nice feature of the postulating the heuristic is that it explains why because or at least why we are comfortable assessing because as factive. I mean, and I'm not actually going to challenge the factiveness of because, but it's factive in both arguments, in the sense that A because B is going to be true only if both A and B separately are true. And the reason for that is, I mean, why with this heuristic we're going to assess things that way is because if somebody asks why A, they're presupposing that A, and also will be something unsatisfactory about the whole exchange if A isn't true. But when they when the answerer says B, they are that involves them in asserting B, and so that would be unsatisfactory if B were not true. So you on this heuristic, you'd expect us to treat because as a doubly factive operator, as indeed we do. Now, I think this Y heuristic, it kind of explains the responses that we give to a whole lot of examples. So for example, if somebody asks why is the proposition that snow is white true, and given the answer snow is white, then that seems like a satisfactory exchange, because we've been given, we've been asked about this complicated thing, and then we've been given an answer which, as it were, reduces the level of complexity, so that, as it were, the answer goes from the kind of simple and clearer thing to the more complicated, involved thing, and which is a good direction for explanation to go in. Whereas, somebody who asks why is Snow White and is given the answer, the proposition that Snow White is true, that the explanation is kind of harder to understand than the thing that is being explained, and it doesn't have any kind of compensating benefits or anything like that. So it's understandable that we would regard that as an unsatisfactory exchange, and then a whole lot of things that we tend to regard as satisfactory, giving us true because statements have that kind of form. I mean, A or B because A. I mean, as long as both sides are true, that seems satisfactory because it's we're starting with something simple. I mean, it's not that all the explanations have to go like this, but we're starting with something simpler and then using that to build up to the more complicated case. And similarly, if you have something is F because A is F, we're starting with something that is kind of easier, just a description of a predicate to a particular individual, and then we're building up to something more complicated involving a quantifier. And so there are a whole lot of cases like this where the Y heuristic works pretty satisfactorily. But there are also cases like the following. So the background to this example now, which we've got in 5 on the handout, is this is a kind of favorite example of mine that comes in handy in a lot of places, but it's actually an example that I think was introduced by Kripke in the paper puzzle about belief. So it involves a pair of synonyms, furs and gauze, which are natural kind terms which pick out exactly the same natural kind. They're totally synonymous. They're not associated with different descriptions or anything like that. Then, if you look at the two sentences, furs is as quickly as gauze, because furs is gauze. I mean, that seems like a pretty reasonable statement, and I mean, it's good to put their emphasis in the right place. Furs is as quickly as gauze, because furs is gauze. And that corresponds to the fact that if somebody asked why is furs as quickly as gauze, being told furs is gauze, that seems like exactly what they need to hear. But if you take 5b, then furs is as quickly as gauze because furs is furs. I mean, that seems really lousy, and if you think of the corresponding exchange where somebody asks why is furs as prickly as gauze, and they're just told furs is furs. I mean, that seems it's not getting anywhere. I mean, they're going to be wondering why on earth you said that. And one thing I should emphasize about this example is that given normal conditions for understanding natural kind terms, it's perfectly possible for somebody to ask the question even though they understand both terms. The fact that they're synonymous and referential and so on does not mean that anybody who understands them will know that they're synonymous. And I mean, I can say more about that, but if you like in the discussion, but that is really just a corollary of normal linguistic standards for understanding natural kingdoms. So it's not that we're dealing with somebody who's actually really asking who doesn't understand one of these words. It's somebody who understands the words, but presumably isn't aware that they are in fact co-referential, and that's a perfectly possible case. So in this case, the natural judgments are that 5a it is true and 5b is false. And those are the judgments that are predicted by the Y heuristic, but it seems that there can't be a difference in truth value between 5a and 5b, and that's not by appeal to some kind of intentionality. It's just because the difference between them is simply in the substitution of synonymous atomic expressions, and so just by the ordinary compositionality of meaning, there shouldn't be any difference in truth value, because nothing has changed at the semantic level. And if you're thinking that maybe there's something implicitly metalinguistic about because, so that it's in some way the because statement is about the words rather than about what words, the things that the words refer to. That would really be giving the game away from the point of view of hyperintentional metaphysics, because the point is supposed to be that because, understood in some robustly metaphysical sense, either a causal or constitutive one, is hyperintentional. And if it turned out that the supposed hyperintentionality was just an artifact of the fact that these are metalinguistic statements, then they wouldn't really be of much metaphysical interest in this context. So so this seems to be like a case where the Y heuristic is giving what must be the wrong answer. It's telling us that one of these is true and the other is false. And it's doing that, not very surprisingly, because our judgments of whether certain conversational exchanges are satisfactory are not purely about the contents, but also about how satisfactorily the contents are expressed. And when it's somebody answering a Y question, the satisfactoriness of that exchange will depend on all sorts of presentational matters. People judge, may even judge these things differently depending on what font is used, or and how clear the print is, and whether the speaker is mumbling, but it can also depend on whether the presentation is perspicuous and orderly or not, because sometimes you can present certain conjuncts. You can have a conjunction in where if you present the conjuncts in one order, it's all very conspicuous. For example, it's on the form A implies B, B implies C, C implies D, D implies E, and so on, where you can just read off the conclusion that the first thing implies the latter by transitivity. But if it's a long conjunction and you mix up the order of the conjuncts, then it'll be much less perspicuous, it'll be much less obvious that the consequence follows. But, well, I mean, maybe you can persuade yourself that the order of the conjuncts is somehow metaphysically significant, but it seems pretty clear that actually all that's going on is that some putting things in one order can be kind of helpful to cognitively to the person asking the question to a greater degree than with a different order of the conjuncts. And so so what we've actually got is a heuristic that is gives assessments in truth value. I should have made that clearer in the formulation of the heuristic. On the basis of the satisfactoriness of the conversational exchange. And the satisfactoriness of the conversational exchange is sensitive to matters of pure presentation, that the truth value of the cause statements is not sensitive to. And so we would expect that the heuristic is giving us was going to give us incorrect answers in some of these cases, and it seems like with the original examples, both the one about snow is white being true and the one about triangularity versus trilaterality, the heuristic will predict the difference in response, but it seems like exactly the sort of case where we might expect that even if things were intentional, this heuristic would be giving a differential response. Of course, the case about the essence of Socrates is a bit different. I mean, it doesn't involve a because statement, but it's actually quite closely connected, because I mean, what Kit Fine is doing in pushing for this hyperintentional account of essence is, I mean, it's meant to be getting closer to the kind of the notion of essence that you find in Aristotle, and in Aristotle, the essence is very closely connected to explanatory matters. I mean, that the essence of something will be central to the kind of explanatory role that the thing can play. I mean, this is something might be David Charles and I mean, of course, just saying he's Socrates, that doesn't seem terribly explanatory, but although you can think of situations in which it would be explanatory. You know, I mean, why is that guy, you know, making a public nuisance by stopping people and asking the questions, and it's Socrates, and so that would be the kind of explanation. But I think you can you know, cases where something more interesting would be going on is, you know, instead of just having Socrates and being a member of Singleton Socrates, he would have being human and being a member of the set of humans, which is a kind of similar point, but where the sort of explanatory role is a bit more obvious. And if you took some explanation of something about Socrates, you know, like why is he mortal or something, human. And if you substituted the human member of the set of humans, that would actually give you a worse explanation, because it would bring in a whole lot of clutter that would just interfere with understanding rather than contributing to it. So in fact, I think that what's going on in the Socrates case is similar as well. And yeah, I don't want to. Actually, yes, I put that in 9A and 9B. And I've given some examples with the 6 and 7 where again we've got because statements where the things are actually necessarily equivalent. And yet they sound different. I mean, they seem much better one way round than the other. I mean, one case that's playing on the equivalence of being round and being round and round, and then the other is it's kind of even equivalence is between sentences that feel cognitively more different because one of them has a constituent and the other doesn't. But in fact, being round is logically equivalent to being either round or both round and red. And so they're logically equivalent, even though one of them has got this kind of extraneous element, the red, which it ends up not doing making any difference to the truth conditions when you put it together like that. And again, it's the direction of explanation that we're happy with is the one where you start off with something, the simple thing, and then build up to the more complicated one, rather than trying to, bringing in the more complicated one to supposedly to explain the simpler one. But it seems like there's no need to postulate anything metaphysically interesting going on there. It's just it's something that you would expect as simply as a byproduct of our reliance on the Y heuristic. So just to kind of, as it were, to give a kind of parody of the hyperintensional approach, with the pair of 8A and 8B. So the background to that example is meant to be a university canteen where the students can sort of help themselves, but this is quite a modern one. And if any student helps themselves to 12 or more pieces of fruit, then then it's a fixed price meal. So if they go for 12 or more pieces of fruit, then an alarm will sound. And so, so one explanation of why did the alarm sound might be that student took 7 apples and 5 oranges. So they took 7 plus 5 pieces of fruit, and 7 plus 5 equals 12. And so a different answer might be, well, a student took 7 apples and 5 oranges, so they took 6 plus 6 pieces of fruit, and 6 plus 6 equals 12. And it's quite clear that 8A is a better, it's a better explanation cognitively than 8B, because 8B has this distracting thing of switching from 7 and 5 to 6 and 6. But if you, what would not be a smart response to this cognitive difference would be to come to the conclusion that what we need is some kind of metaphysics of numbers on which 7 plus 5 is not equal to 6 plus 6. I mean, that's a kind of analog of the sorts of moves in life that the hyperintentionalist is making. That they're, as it were, introducing a metaphysical distinction to explain something which is actually just a fairly predictable cognitive effect. I want to give just to finish with just another example where I think that that some kind of cognitive effect is producing this sort of interference in a slightly different way from the cases I've been talking about. So for example, take 10A and 10B. So the plane crash made Mary an orphan, and the plane crash made Mary a self-identical orphan. So so I think I mean, we're to imagine a case where Mary's parents died in the plane crash, and it seems like somebody would might accept 10A but kind of balk at 10B and say, no, I mean 10B is wrong because it made Mary an orphan, but it didn't make her a self-identical orphan because she was self-identical already. So the plane crash had nothing to do with that. And so you might think, but of course, orphan and self-identical orphan, those are necessarily equivalent. So you might think that was, and that's an example of hyperintentionality with the maid relation, which is, well, exactly whether it's causal or constitutive, but it seems like some kind of metaphysical relation. So just to cast some doubt on that, if you look at 11A and 11B, this actually refers to an episode in the Wars of the Roses in 15th century England. So Edward here is actually Edward IV, and Richard is Warwick, the kingmaker, not the truth maker, but the Warwick, the kingmaker. And so it's just a matter of history that Richard's actions made Edward a king. Now, this is the most controversial bit of this talk when I go here was where the king is synonymous with male monarch. But you could take it from that, at least in many dialects of English, the king and male monarch are synonymous. So if Richard's actions made Edward a king, then Richard's actions made Edward a male monarch, because all we've done is substitute the definition of king for okay. So there's no difference in meaning. But you can imagine somebody could easily accept 11A, but balk at 11B and say that Richard's actions, well, they made Edward a monarch, but they didn't make him a male monarch because he was a male already. So, and so 11B is open to exactly the same kind of objection. I mean, it makes exactly the same kind of objection, kind of a natural thing to say as 10B. But in the case of 11B, there can't be a difference. I mean, assuming that we're not talking about some metalinguistic thing that wouldn't be of interest in metaphysics, there can't be a difference in truth value between 11A and 11B. And so it must be that 11B is true as well. Of course, it's kind of a misleading thing to say, because why did you if you're using the word monarch, why do you bother to add the word male if it's not relevant? And there was no need to add that, because it's kind of conversationally misleading, because you've added an extra component there that isn't, you know, isn't really relevant to the topic, and so that can, you know, make one, you know, if one's sort of instinctively searching for a reading that would make it relevant, then you have, you know, you start thinking, oh, some weird reading on which, you know, Richard's actions made Edward male as well as making him a monarch, and, you know, which is wrong. But that sort of psychological reaction to, you know, which is kind of closely related to Bryce's conversation and literature, that can explain why we're not so happy with 11b, or would also explain why we're not so happy with 10b. So that's just another example of a case, you know, sort of case which I've heard being used as you know, a putative counterexample to an intentional account of making relation, why we're dealing with something that is just not a safe counterexample at all, because there is a very natural explanation of why we would be balking at one of these sentences and not the other. In very similar cases, where that as it were balking reaction just isn't correct. So just to sum up what I've been saying, the kinds of example that are used to quotes refute an intentional treatment of the constructions in question can be very easily and naturally explained in terms of the kinds of cognitive heuristics there's independent evidence that we're using, and independent evidence that these heuristics are not fully reliable. And well, in one case, heuristics with the final examples about making something to do with conversation and literature may also be going on, which is a slightly different thing. And so we shouldn't regard these as cogent counterexamples to an intentional treatment of these cases, because they're things that could be predicted, you know, assuming a common given intentionalism and, you know, and some psychologically plausible accounts of how we make judgments of these matters. You'd expect us to come out with these differences, even when there isn't, in fact, a genuine difference in truth value. And so that's a case study in how we can exhibit the methodological vice of overfitting in metaphysics by not by having a bad character or something, but simply by being, you know, unaware of the possibilities for error in the data, and why, and it shows how, as it were, this attitude of just being willing to kind of introduce any amount of complication in order to accommodate what are supposedly you know, decisive data points, introduces theoretical pathologies into metaphysics. So, thanks.